Over the last year or so, I've contemplated using the NeuralDSP Quad Cortex to replace my amp, but it's expensive, really big, and doesn't do everything my pedal board does. So I'd have to integrate it into my pedal board, which seemed like overkill. I had looked at other amp sims like the Kemper Profiler Player, but I'm not a fan of the Kemper interface. It doesn't have the ability to perform captures, it's big, and is a little pricey. I also looked at the IK Multimedia Tonex, but you need a separate device to make captures, offsetting the cost. Plus, I've heard making captures is a bit of a hassle. After nearly giving up on this endeavor, NeuralDSP released the Nano Cortex. At first glance, it's a washed-down version of their flagship Quad Cortex, but at only a fraction of the cost. But can this little device replace my amp? We're going to find out. If you're unfamiliar with the Quad Cortex, it's a powerhouse of a device aimed at replacing your guitar amp and even pedal board with its plethora of amp sims created using their neural capture technology, as well as a large list of effects. You can use any of the supplied amps and pedals or create your own neural captures directly with the device. Many well-known bands use the Quad Cortex live like Megadeth, Tesseract, Sleep Token, Five Finger Death Punch, and Epica, among many others. The Quad Cortex is an absolute monster of a device, but it does come with a pretty steep price tag, around $1,700 US. While the device is probably worth that, if you don't need all the features it has to offer like myself, it's a hard pill to swallow. But now, NeuralDSP offers the Nano Cortex at only a fraction of the price at $550 US. But as you may expect, it only has a fraction of the features. Let's start with the features it does have. It has 7 fixed device blocks, which include a neural capture block, an IR loader block, 2 pre-effects blocks for an adaptive gate and transpose, and 3 post-effects blocks for a chorus, analog delay, and mind hall reverb. It has neural capture technology built in, so you can use the XLR combo jack on the side to capture amps, cabs, and drive pedals. You can save up to 256 neural captures, 256 impulse responses, and 64 presets. It has controls for gain, a 3-band EQ, effects level, and global level. The 2 foot switches are rotary encoders as well, so you can twist them to select captures and impulse responses. Each foot switch can be used to select 2 presets, which makes 4 presets easily available. It has Bluetooth functionality to connect to your phone or tablet to set up presets, and connect to the Cortex Cloud to access and share user-created captures. There's an onboard tuner. For I/O, it has the XLR combo jack for captures, as I mentioned earlier, 1 input, 2 outputs, an expression/MIDI input, headphone output with dedicated headphone volume control, a USB-C port which allows it to be used as a 48 kHz 24-bit audio interface, send MIDI messages over USB, or be used to supply power. You can also supply power with a 9 to 12 volt DC power input. It does recommend using a minimum of 600 milliamps, but I haven't seen it go above 400 milliamps in my measurements, so a 500 milliamp power output should be just fine. The size of the Nano Cortex is worth noting as well. With a footprint of only 5.6 by 4 inches, it is significantly smaller than the Quad Cortex, measuring at 11.4 by 7 inches. That means the Nano takes up 72% less space than the Quad with the same quality, albeit somewhat limited tones. What are these limitations? Let's start with the limited number of preset effects. Like I mentioned before, you are limited to an adaptive noise gate and transpose as pre-effects and chorus delay and reverb for post-effects, and you can't change their order. Additionally, you only have 1 neural capture and 1 impulse response available, so if you wanted to use a neural capture for an amp, cab, and drive pedal at the same time, you're out of luck. You would have to capture them together. While editing on the unit itself is possible, it is quite difficult since there is no display, which makes sense for the compact size of the unit. You can hit the bank button to switch between the 5 neural capture banks. Each bank contains 5 captures. You can also switch between those captures with the left rotary foot switch, or choose to bypass the neural capture block altogether. To switch between IRs, use the right rotary foot switch to select between the 5 loaded or select none. The gain and 3-band EQ are dedicated to the neural capture. The level control is a global output level and is not tied to the patch. It took me a minute to realize this. The pre and post effects can be turned on or off with the effects button, and only 1 parameter can be adjusted with the amount control. More controls can be adjusted using the Cortex app. If you want to use any of the effects, or you can't remember what is loaded in the 25 neural captures or 5 impulse response slots, you'll need to use the app, especially for setting up new presets. Quick adjustments can be made without the app. Connecting to the app and using it is actually pretty easy and relatively straightforward. Just follow the instructions in the manual. Here you can access anything on the device plus more. You can select any of the 64 presets and assign them to a foot switch if you'd like. In the preset, you can select any of the 25 loaded neural captures or 5 loaded impulse responses. You might remember earlier when I said you can store 256 neural captures and 256 impulse responses, but this is the second time I've mentioned only being able to load 25 captures and 5 IRs. You can access all 256 captures and IRs, but it's not intuitive. In the app, you can swap out neural captures in the 25 available blocks and impulse responses in the 5 available blocks. When creating or editing a patch, you'll only have access to these blocks. This makes sense when selecting captures or IRs on the device itself, but is very limiting in the app. Without getting into the mud, in order to select a capture or IR when first setting up a preset, it has to be in one of the loaded blocks. If you later remove that capture or IR from its block, it will still be saved in the preset. Then if you go back into the preset, you can select any capture or IR loaded on the device. In my opinion, it's a really weird way to do it. Hopefully they'll give you an option to select any capture or IR right off the bat in a future update. The last thing you can do in the app with presets is turn the effects block on or off and open them to adjust the respective parameters. In the app, you can also go through your captures and IRs. The Nano comes loaded with 25 factory captures and 10 impulse responses. You can search for captures and add them in the app. The only way to add impulse responses is through a browser on the Cortex Cloud website. The factory captures are fine, although I haven't worked with them too much. I immediately captured my JP2C. Having access to the other 92 captures available on the Quad Cortex would have been nice. From what I can tell, there is no way to add them to the Nano. The 10 factory IRs are pretty good, but don't leave you with a lot of options. For instance, 3 of the 8 guitar IRs use vintage 30 speakers. I would have liked to see a little more variety. On the Quad Cortex, there are 47 guitar cabinets and 6 bass cabinets available, only 8 guitar and 2 bass cabinets on the Nano. All the factory impulses have several microphones and positions to choose from. While this is nice, I wish you could use multiple microphones and mix them. If you select a user IR, you'll only be able to adjust the level as well as high pass and low pass filters, which are also available with the factory IRs. Additionally, in the app, you can adjust settings like device name, LED brightness, for preset mode, knob operation, set up MIDI or expression input, set the MIDI channel, perform a factory reset, determine what program change number is for MIDI control, and set up USB MIDI outputs based on the current preset or foot switch. While the app is responsive, I am getting a little annoyed with everything needing an app to function. And since the Nano is so reliant on the app, if NeuralDSP goes out of business and the app is no longer supported, that could make the device pretty much useless. Just something to keep in mind. The last thing you can do with the app and on the device is perform a neural capture. I'm not going to go into the whole process, but it's actually quite easy. Although there are some quirks, but only takes about 6 minutes. I created some captures of only my JP2C without the cab using the output from my Tone King Iron Man 2 with a TS-808 in front of the amp. I have some of these captures available if you want to check them out. You can also use the Nano standalone to make the capture, but I'd recommend using the app. That way you can name the capture and add some notes. I found it's easiest to make a quick name and description while the unit is creating the capture, then upload it to the cloud and put in all the details afterwards on the Cortex Cloud website. Now let's see how this sounds. I'm not going to go into every nook and cranny, but I'm going to show you 2 guitar patches. One is going to use a stock capture on the Nano, John CA channel 3.7, which is a capture of the JP2C, with the 412 CA stand OS AV3001 factory impulse response. The noise gate, chorus, and reverb are also activated. The fastest you can set the delay is 200 milliseconds, and since I like to use a much shorter delay for my rhythm patches, 50 or 60 milliseconds, I haven't activated it. But here's what it sounds like real quick. For the second, I'm going to integrate the Nano into my pedal board. On the Nano, I'm going to use a capture that I made of channel 2 on my JP2C with a TS-808 in front. I'll be using the same factory impulse response as the other patch and the noise gate on the Nano as well. On my pedal board, I'll be using my Strymon Timeline Delay and Boss GT1000 Core for a graphic EQ, CE1 chorus, and Hall reverb. All the effects are after the Nano. Let's see how the two guitar patches sound next to each other. To me, the stock capture sounds good, but I prefer my capture with the TS-808 in front and the EQ set the way I prefer. One thing I noticed when creating captures is the 3-band EQ on the Nano will probably not act the same way as the EQ on your amp. The Nano's EQ is a simple graphic EQ. Each band has plus minus 6 decibels of adjustment. If you're interested, the center frequencies are 120 Hz, 760 Hz, and 11 kHz for the bass, mid, and treble bands respectively. The 3-band EQ on the JP2C is much more complicated. It's not just a simple boost or cut, and all 3 bands interact with each other. For instance, if the bass and treble are turned all the way down, the mid-band acts as a volume control. The difference in EQ adjustment means when making captures, you need to dial in the EQ on the amp before making the capture. This does make the captures not quite as universal if you want to have vastly different EQ settings. I should note, I also used one of the additional graphic EQs on the JP2C as well when making my capture. This does make relying on captures found on the Cortex Cloud not as appealing. One capture for one amp might not do it for you, but looking through the database, users have learned from this and they are uploading various EQ settings for their amps. You'll just have to sift through a few captures before you find one that works for you. There are a few things I would have liked to see in this device. My biggest request would be a 10-band graphic EQ. It's just so useful in sculpting your tone. The second would be more factory impulse responses, like I mentioned before, and the ability to use multiple microphones. This would probably require multiple IR blocks. Even one additional block would be nice. While we're on that subject, more neural capture blocks. At least 2, if not 3. That way you could have a drive pedal, amp, and cabinet. However, you could just use an IR for the cabinet, so I'd be okay with 2. More effects options and the ability to move them around would be nice, but not a big deal for me, especially with how I plan to use the Nano. The ability to move around presets would be great to see. While it's not a huge deal, keeping groups of presets together would make my OCD happy. And being able to copy a preset instead of having to start from scratch would be great. Having an amp on your computer that you can use to control and adjust the Nano via the USB-C port would have been nice too. But with how simple the setup process is, I get why they only offer the phone app. Lastly, I'd like to see a non-USB MIDI output. Making the MIDI expression input an 1/8 inch instead of a 1/4, and adding an 1/8 inch MIDI output would make MIDI setup easier. Right now, I just split the MIDI out signal from another pedal, which you can easily do with a splitter, but it would make cable runs a little easier. FYI, the MIDI input does use the same pinout as Boss pedals with an 1/8 inch MIDI jack. Speaking of MIDI, I do think having MIDI control is almost a necessity to use the Nano Cortex. You only have access to 4 presets with the foot switches, so if you have more than 4 presets you need to access during a show, you'll definitely want to use MIDI control. MIDI has been a huge part of my rig for years using the ES8, so integrating it won't be a problem for me. Just something to keep in mind. So can you use the Nano Cortex to replace your amp? In a live scenario, I certainly think so. While it's not going to replace your entire pedal board, the Nano's relatively small footprint makes it easy to add to that pedal board. And if you wanted to use it for recording, it wouldn't be too bad, but the limitations with the number of factory impulse responses and microphone placements makes it not as desirable. The Quad Cortex might be a better option for you there. But what if you wanted to use it standalone? That really depends on what you need. For me, there's no way it would work, but for some it might. You just have to be okay with the limited effects and easy access to only 4 patches. As much as I love my JP2C, I've been getting really sick of lugging around the amp and cabinet, running the cables to my pedal board, and setting up a microphone. My band also travels with our own PA, so I take a bigger responsibility in setting that up as well. So being able to just set down my pedal board and run one cable to the PA significantly reduces my setup time. This will also give me the option to use other neural captures other than my JP2C when a song might call for it, assuming I can find good ones. I am in the process of integrating the Nano Cortex into my pedal board. Subscribe if you want to see updates on that. But what do you think of the Nano? Would you use it to replace your amp? Let me know in the comments. But hey, until next time, rock on.